A single wrong line on a secret map nearly changed the course of World War II. In the tense days before D-Day, forged maps guided Allied forces toward disaster, a deception so perfect no one saw it coming. One man discovered the truth hidden in plain sight, but was it already too late? June 1943. North Africa was quiet for the first time in months. The sand still carried the echoes of engines and marching boots, but now, in the newly liberated fields near Tunis, the Americans were already looking toward the sea, and beyond it, Sicily. Inside a dusty command tent, rows of tables were covered with maps, thin sheets of paper that would decide the fate of thousands. Topographical details marked in red and blue: beaches, cliffs, inland roads, enemy fortifications. Every inch mattered. Every mistake could change history. The maps had just arrived. Official U.S. Army issue, sealed, stamped, and logged. They came directly from Washington's Army Map Service, the same institution that built the geographical backbone of the Allied war. Every contour, every line, drawn with scientific precision. Or so everyone believed. No one in that tent could have imagined that one piece of paper might hold more danger than a German artillery shell. For the Allied command, accuracy was sacred. Amphibious assaults lived or died on the truth contained within a few square feet of printed ink. The chosen beaches in southern Sicily had been selected based on these maps. Gradients measured, obstacles noted, approaches confirmed. Commanders trusted that the paper before them was reality. But war had already entered a new phase, one where the enemy fought not only with weapons, but with information. At a British liaison desk, Captain Andrew Faulkner leaned over his copy of the same coastal chart the Americans were using. His eyes traced the measurements along the shore near Gela. Something bothered him. The depth markings didn't match what the Royal Air Force's reconnaissance photos showed. The maps claimed safe passage for landing craft at a certain stretch of beach, but aerial imagery revealed shallower water, enough to strand vehicles before they even reached land. He mentioned it in passing to his American counterpart, an operations officer buried under planning paperwork. The response was casual, a nod, a laugh, a reminder that different surveys often produce small variations. Maybe a difference in tide, maybe a misreading. Faulkner dropped it. Everyone was too busy preparing for the next battle. The Sicily invasion date was approaching, and doubts were inconvenient. In Washington, the Army Map Service worked around the clock. Thousands of technicians, cartographers, and draftsmen pored over captured enemy charts, aerial photographs, and survey data. Their mission? Map every inch of Axis territory before the troops reached it. Precision was their pride. Each batch of maps was printed, stamped, and sent through secure military channels to various Allied planning centers across the Atlantic. In theory, the process was flawless. Multiple verification points, tight access control, coded distribution logs. In practice, it depended on one fragile thing: trust. Weeks later, in the humid evenings of June, the beaches of North Africa glowed under the lanterns of Allied briefings. Commanders gathered in circles, pointing at the maps, memorizing the terrain of a place they had never seen. No one questioned the paper. The ink seemed honest, the measurements scientific. And yet, beneath the calm of preparation, something invisible was already at work. The enemy had learned that maps could move armies more efficiently than propaganda broadcasts. They understood that if you could shape a soldier's belief in geography, you could shape his fate before he ever fired a shot. That night, as the desert wind whipped against the tents, several sets of maps sat quietly inside sealed crates at the dockyards of Algiers, waiting to be shipped to forward bases. The seals looked authentic, the signatures legitimate, every form signed and approved. But one of those crates, nobody knew which, carried something different. The paper looked the same, the printing perfect, the texture identical. Yet a few coordinates were slightly off. A road that didn't exist appeared clearly marked. A beach gradient adjusted just enough to mislead a landing craft. The smallest of differences, invisible to the eye, deadly in consequence.
Weeks later, as Allied ships moved towards Sicily, the deception remained unnoticed. The same unseen hands that shaped those maps had already ensured that they would pass every layer of inspection. When the first waves of landing craft approached the beaches, some found smooth sand exactly where expected. Others hit unexpected shoals. Vehicles bogged down. Units landed farther east than planned. Confusion spread, but orders were clear: advance inland at all costs. After the battle, reports trickled back. Some beaches had been perfectly charted, others not quite. A few officers noted that the maps they used didn't match the terrain they faced. The assumption was simple: outdated intelligence. Maybe German engineers had changed the shoreline. Maybe weather shifted the sandbars. Nobody thought to look deeper.
The documents were collected, filed, and forgotten. But somewhere in Berlin, inside a quiet office lined with printing presses, a group of German analysts watched the aftermath with quiet satisfaction. Their experiment had worked. In North Africa, nobody yet suspected that this was just the beginning. The silent invasion had already begun, not across seas, but through the channels of trust and information. And it would take nearly a year before anyone realized how close the Allies had come to walking into a perfectly engineered illusion. England was a fortress of preparation. The air carried a sense of destiny, as if everyone knew that soon the war would reach its turning point. Beneath layers of secrecy, planners of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force studied one coastline more than any other: Normandy. Across damp barracks and candle-lit planning rooms, maps stretched across tables like veins of the future. Each colored line, each contour, would decide the course of the coming invasion. Everything, the timing, the tides, the landings, depended on what these maps said. Fresh shipments of coastal maps had arrived from the Army Map Service in Washington. The paper was crisp, the authentication marks flawless. Serial numbers matched official records. They looked every bit as legitimate as the maps used for Sicily. Except these were more detailed, more refined. The stakes were higher now. The invasion of Europe, the long-awaited Second Front, would rest entirely on these printed sheets. Engineering officers studied gradients and tidal zones. They marked where tanks might cross the sand. Infantry planners traced routes inland, identifying choke points and likely ambush sites. Artillery teams used the elevation notes to position their guns in the imagined landscape. To them, the map was the battlefield. No one in those crowded English rooms thought about where the paper came from, only what it told them. One man, however, couldn't shake a feeling. Lawrence Brennan, a young American cartographer assigned to the London distribution office, spent his days inspecting and cataloging incoming shipments. It was routine work, counting stacks, checking seals, signing receipts. He was precise, methodical, the kind of person who noticed when a decimal point sat slightly higher than usual. Late one night, under the glow of a single desk lamp, Brennan compared two nearly identical Normandy sheets. To the naked eye, they were the same. But under his magnifying lens, something shifted. The alignment of color plates, cyan, magenta, and black, was off by the slightest fraction, barely visible. Yet, for Brennan, it was enough to spark unease. He ran his fingers across the paper. It felt different, softer somehow. Not the usual American fiber mix used by the Army Map Service. This one had a faintly smoother texture, almost continental. He didn't know why it bothered him, only that it did. He reported it to his supervisor, a tired logistics officer buried in reports. The man chuckled and dismissed it as overanalysis. Different printers, different batches, nothing more. The war machine had no time for perfectionists. Brennan returned to his desk, staring at the stacks of maps that filled the room. Every one of them represented a landing zone,
A battalion's plan, a soldier's fate. What if one of them was wrong? Outside, winter's storms battered the English coast. Men trained in rain and mud, unaware that the paper guiding their future might not be entirely what it seemed. Each week brought new shipments from Washington, each marked with official seals and routing codes. But somewhere in the chain, unseen hands had begun their quiet work again. Small inconsistencies, harmless enough to slip past even trained eyes. The irony was cruel. The Allies believed they had tightened security after Sicily. Verification protocols improved, serial tracking stricter. Yet those very improvements gave them a false sense of safety. They trusted the process completely. And that trust was the perfect weapon. In London's intelligence circles, whispers had started months earlier. Fragments of intercepted German messages about paper cargo and printing shipments. But the references were too vague to pursue. The British believed it referred to propaganda leaflets, not military maps. No one yet connected the dots between Sicily's confusion and Normandy's preparations. In an underground map room near Portsmouth, senior officers gathered for a late-night strategy session. They discussed terrain features, German defensive structures, and likely resistance. The maps were spread across the table like a gospel of truth. Every decision, every movement, every landing schedule, all drawn from those colored sheets. Somewhere among them lay a forgery so precise that even under magnification, it could pass for genuine. Outside, Brennan walked home through the blackout streets, the city silent except for distant anti-aircraft guns. He couldn't stop thinking about the faint smell of the paper. The ink seemed wrong, too, sharper, more metallic. It was absurd, he told himself. The war had made everyone paranoid. But when he closed his eyes that night, he saw the maps, the lines shifting like shadows. As D-Day drew closer, the Allied machine accelerated. Trains carried crates of maps to every command post, every airfield, every naval base. Millions of copies circulated, each vital, each trusted. The deception, if it existed, was buried under mountains of bureaucracy. By February, engineers had already built full-scale mock-ups of the Normandy beaches for training. Tank crews practiced their runs using the printed terrain. Paratroopers memorized drop zones marked in red. Every man's understanding of France came from paper. Paper that no one had ever truly verified. The war was now as much about trust as about force. If the maps were right, the invasion would succeed. If they were wrong, history would take another path. In the quiet halls of intelligence offices, analysts worked through coded German transmissions. A few contained references to Operation Kartenfelscher, the Map Faker project. But the translation teams, buried under piles of intercepted data, tagged it as low priority. A propaganda initiative, perhaps. Nothing more. And so, the maps remained in use. The invasion plans continued. Somewhere behind a closed door in Berlin, a printing press was already rolling. Fresh sheets, flawless and deadly, ready to be slipped into the very veins of the Allied supply chain. Brennan didn't know it yet, but his unease had just placed him on a collision course with one of the most elaborate deception operations of the war. The kind that didn't explode, it unfolded, slowly, invisibly. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, the enemy's fingerprints would already be all over the truth itself.
July 1943. The sun rose over the Mediterranean like fire over glass. Allied convoys dotted the horizon. Thousands of ships, each carrying men, vehicles, and the hopes of two continents. The invasion of Sicily had begun. The maps dictated everything. Where the troops landed, where tanks rolled, where artillery set its range. For months, those printed lines had guided every plan. And now those plans were being tested by reality. At dawn, the first waves of landing craft pushed through choppy water toward the beaches near Jela and Licata. Commanders clutched their map cases, their faith resting in the charts drawn in Washington and confirmed in London. Some units landed exactly where predicted: firm sand, easy gradient, smooth advance inland. Others were less fortunate. Several craft grounded far too early, stuck on unseen shoals. Tanks rolled into deeper water than expected. Vehicles stalled in soft terrain that was never marked on any map. Communication lines broke down as commanders struggled to orient themselves. Reports came in throughout the day. Inland routes that were supposed to lead toward key towns simply didn't exist. In other places, defensive structures appeared miles away from where they were supposed to be. It wasn't chaos, but it was confusion. And in war, confusion could be fatal.
By nightfall, the Allies had secured their beachheads. Victory seemed clear, yet among the success reports lay quiet notes of dissonance. Field engineers marked mismatched gradients. Logistics officers flagged incorrect road coordinates. Intelligence analysts logged discrepancies, but found no pattern. After-action reviews came weeks later. The tone was cautious. The landings had succeeded, but certain map data hadn't matched real terrain. Some blamed shifting sands, others pointed to outdated reconnaissance. A few suspected that German engineers had deliberately altered the coastline. Nobody mentioned forgery. That word didn't exist in the vocabulary of trust. In Washington, analysts read the reports without alarm. The variances seemed minor, normal errors in wartime mapping. In London, the British Liaison Office forwarded similar findings from their own units. To them, it was the inevitable cost of complexity. After all, war never followed paper perfectly, and so the case was closed before it ever opened. Months passed. Sicily fell. The Allies moved north toward Italy, but the pattern, quiet, hidden, and dangerous, remained. Somewhere deep in Allied archives, two sets of maps lay side by side, one genuine, one false. No one noticed that small differences in shading, scale, and numbering matched precisely the inconsistencies from the invasion. The deception had worked because it didn't aim to stop the attack. It only needed to slow it, to create hesitation, a delay measured not in hours, but in trust. Trust had become the most valuable weapon of the war. Historians would later describe the Sicilian campaign as a rehearsal for Normandy. They were right, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The lessons learned on those beaches were recorded in charts and reports. Yet the most critical lesson of all, that information could be poisoned, never made it onto paper. In Berlin, deep within an anonymous facility outside the city, the Obver quietly celebrated. Their experiment, codenamed Operation Kartenfälscher, the map faker, had achieved its first silent victory. The German cartographers, experts recruited from civilian printing houses, studied the Allied response through captured documents and intercepted communications. They noted which errors were noticed and which were ignored. The data was priceless. Every overlooked anomaly confirmed what they already knew. The Allies trusted their own system too much to question its core. So the Germans planned their next move, to strike not on the battlefield, but inside the very structure of Allied logistics. Meanwhile, in London, Lawrence Brennan worked unnoticed among stacks of fresh Normandy charts, unaware that what had happened in Sicily would soon happen again, only this time on a scale that could decide the fate of Europe. The official after-action summary for Sicily closed with a single sentence: minor discrepancies observed in topographical data, likely due to pre-invasion environmental shifts. That sentence became the quiet barrier between truth and discovery. The deception remained buried.
The maps were trusted again, and the Germans learned the most dangerous truth of all, that the best way to deceive an enemy was to give him exactly what he expected to see. The Sicilian beaches faded into memory, but their lesson, invisible, unspoken, was about to echo across the English Channel. Late 1943, in a quiet industrial district outside Berlin, far from the thunder of air raids, stood an old printing facility with blackout curtains drawn tight. No soldiers guarded the gate, no flags flew above its roof. To the untrained eye, it looked like any other civilian workshop. But behind those walls, a different kind of weapon was being forged, one made not of metal, but of ink and deception.
The operation carried the code name Unternehmen Kartenfälscher, Operation Map Faker. It was the brainchild of Colonel Heinrich Kruger, a precise man with the calm focus of an engineer and the mind of a chess player. He believed the war could be fought through perception as much as through bullets. His theory was simple. If you could distort what an army believed about the ground beneath its feet, you could shape its fate before it even began to fight. The operation started months earlier, after the Sicilian landings. The Germans had learned that small map discrepancies caused disproportionate confusion. Kruger's team realized that they didn't need to rewrite entire coastlines, just to bend them slightly, to make truth and lie indistinguishable. Inside the factory, teams of civilian experts worked day and night. They were not soldiers, but artists, cartographers, paper chemists, engravers, typographers, many taken from Germany's top publishing houses. Some had spent their lives perfecting fonts for atlases and school books. Now their talents were turned toward war. Every authentic Allied map that fell into German hands was studied like scripture. They dissected the line thickness, the ink layers, even the slight imperfections from American printing presses. The smallest irregularities were cataloged and reproduced. The greatest challenge was not copying, it was matching. Matching the exact paper stock, the chemical composition of American ink, the stamping pressure of official seals. The Germans imported pulp fibers through neutral countries, blending them until they produced the precise weight and texture of U.S. military map paper. Even microscopic fibers in the margins were replicated. In another room, metallurgists studied captured authentication stamps. They learned the exact hardness of the American alloys used to emboss the Army Map Service logo. Using those findings, they built replicas indistinguishable from the originals. The precision bordered on obsession. Kruger oversaw every batch personally. He would hold a forged map under the light, comparing it to the real one, line by line, ridge by ridge. When the two were finally identical, he would nod once, the only approval his team ever saw. But forgery was only the first part of the plan. The real challenge was infiltration. The Germans knew that direct delivery into Allied channels was impossible, so they looked outward, to the neutral nations whose ports and mail routes quietly connected both sides of the war. In Lisbon, a network of operatives disguised as dock clerks and postal intermediaries began intercepting Allied cargo. Some crates marked with the Army Map Service's overseas offices were quietly opened in back rooms. The genuine maps were removed, copied, and replaced with the forged versions. The seals were reattached with the same wax mixture used by Allied packers. Every tampered crate was weighed to match the original down to the ounce. From there, the shipments continued on their way, through the same postal routes, the same ships, the same inspection stations. By the time they reached Allied headquarters in London or North Africa, the deception was invisible. The plan's brilliance lay in its restraint. Kruger knew that large-scale falsification would risk discovery, so only a small percentage of maps were altered, enough to cause disruption, but not suspicion. 1 in every 20 crates, sometimes fewer. The goal wasn't to destroy armies, it was to erode certainty. The forgery showed roads that didn't exist, rivers slightly misaligned, gradients too gentle or too steep. Each detail seemed harmless alone. Together, they could misdirect an entire invasion. For Kruger, it wasn't about ink and paper anymore. It was psychological warfare at its purest. He often told his aides that maps are the mind of an army. Change the map, and you change the mind. By December, the operation had reached perfection. New map series were printed for the northern coast of France, particularly the Normandy region. They were designed to look indistinguishable from the official sets that Allied command would soon rely upon for the largest amphibious landing in history. As Allied generals debated beaches and tides, Kruger's maps were already on their way across neutral ports. A few months from now, they would rest in the very hands of the men planning the invasion of Europe.
Berlin intelligence reports labeled Operation Kartenfallschir as one of the Reich's quiet triumphs. Not a single Allied counterintelligence unit had discovered it. No intercepted message hinted at its existence. Yet Kruger was not a man of celebration. He stood in the factory's dim corridor, watching the presses roll out another perfect forgery. The smell of fresh ink heavy in the air. He understood something his superiors didn't. That deception, once begun, had a life of its own. In war, falsehoods could outlive the men who created them. Somewhere, an American officer would soon open a crate and unroll one of these maps, never knowing that the lines before him were drawn not in Washington, but in Berlin. For the Germans, it was the perfect illusion. For the Allies, it was a trap waiting in plain sight. And for Lawrence Brennan, still unaware of Kruger's existence, it would soon become the obsession that would consume everything he knew about truth, trust, and war itself.
London, early 1944. Outside, the sky trembled with the distant hum of aircraft returning from night missions. Inside the cartography offices of Allied command, another kind of war was unfolding, one of ink, paper, and suspicion. Lawrence Brennan sat alone at his desk long after most lights had gone out. His hands rested on two maps, identical at first glance, yet he knew they were not the same. He had compared every contour, every symbol, every printed number. Something felt wrong. He didn't know it yet, but he was staring at the front line of the world's quietest battle. For months, Brennan had processed shipments of newly printed maps arriving from the United States. He inspected seals, cataloged numbers, and distributed copies to military planners preparing for the Normandy invasion. It was repetitive work, yet he found comfort in precision. Until one night, when the comfort turned into unease. He noticed tiny inconsistencies that others dismissed as printing flaws. A faint difference in shade, a slightly shifted label, a hairline deviation in contour spacing. Most would never see it, but Brennan did. It was his curse and his gift. He began collecting samples from each shipment. At first only a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. He compared them under magnification, tracing every pixel of difference like a detective following footprints in sand.
Patterns began to emerge. Certain sections of coastline used inks with a denser metallic sheen. Others showed paper fibers inconsistent with American production. The variations weren't random. They clustered around specific areas of France. Mostly the northern coast. Mostly Normandy. He felt the chill of realization. Someone had changed the maps. Not many, just enough. He brought his concerns to his supervisor, who barely looked up from his reports. Different printers, Brennan. Different presses. Different ink. Stop chasing ghosts. But ghosts were exactly what Brennan saw. Shadows moving through the machinery of trust. He couldn't let it go.
He began staying late after curfew, using lamps dimmed behind blackout curtains to study each specimen. He measured the color separations using a handmade gauge. He analyzed the alignment marks in the margins. Under his lens, the truth unfolded. Some maps didn't just look different, they were different. The more he uncovered, the more isolated he became. His colleagues whispered that he was becoming obsessive. His superiors warned him not to question official supply channels. The system works, they said. Don't become the problem. But Brennan couldn't unsee what he'd seen. Every small discovery added weight to his conviction. He began documenting everything in a secret ledger. Map numbers, ink types, even the microscopic weave of paper fibers. He didn't know how deep it went, only that it wasn't accidental. One evening, while retrieving a shipment report from the Intelligence Records Office, Brennan crossed paths with Major Helen Kowalski. She was known among officers for her expertise in forgery detection. Once an art historian before the war, now working quietly in counterintelligence. She noticed the exhaustion in his face and the stack of papers in his arms. "You look like a man searching for something that doesn't want to be found," she said. He hesitated, then showed her 2 maps under the hallway light. The differences were invisible to most eyes, but she saw them instantly. Her gaze sharpened. That was the moment an alliance began. A quiet, dangerous one.
Over the next weeks, they worked in secret. Late at night, in an unused archive room beneath the War Office, they laid out hundreds of map sheets across the floor. The air smelled of paper and dust, and each new discovery pulled them deeper into a mystery neither had the authority to solve. Kowalski arranged for discreet testing. A sympathetic scientist in a nearby lab agreed to analyze the paper composition. When the results came back, she stared at them in disbelief. The fibers weren't American. They were traced to paper mills in Central Europe. The ink analysis confirmed it. The chemical ratios matched those used in German printing presses. And the final blow, the metal composition of the authentication seals was slightly off. A difference invisible to the naked eye, but measurable under spectrograph testing. The maps weren't just flawed, they were forged. Brennan's heart sank. He had been right all along, and that terrified him more than being wrong ever could.
Kowalski reported her findings through quiet channels. Official response was cautious. They were thanked for their attention to procedural detail, but told to avoid further independent investigation. The tone was polite and unmistakably final. But Brennan refused to stop. He knew too much. He spent nights reconstructing the path of each map shipment. Some had traveled through neutral ports, Lisbon, Stockholm, Bern. He marked the routes with red pins on a wall map, tracing the flow like veins through a living body. Each pin connected to another. Each connection whispered the same truth. Someone had infiltrated the Allied supply chain. By March, Brennan and Kowalski had gathered enough evidence to prove it. They compiled their findings in a classified dossier. Photographs, lab results, chain of custody records. When they presented it to a select intelligence panel, the room fell silent. The implications were staggering. If German intelligence had been forging Allied maps, it meant that part of the invasion planning itself could be compromised. One senior officer finally spoke. "If what you're saying is true, we're standing on a foundation built by the enemy." The words hung in the air. No one wanted to believe them.
In the following days, Brennan and Kowalski were instructed to stop all independent analysis. The matter was being handled internally. Their access to distribution logs was quietly revoked. It was meant to silence them. Instead, it confirmed everything they feared. For Brennan, sleep vanished. Every map he touched felt like a lie. every shipment a threat. He knew time was running out, the invasion was approaching, and no one was ready to face what he'd uncovered. But he also knew something else. Deception this precise couldn't happen without help from the inside. Someone within their own system had been feeding information to the enemy. The discovery had begun with paper. Now it was about trust. The quiet war Brennan had stumbled into was no longer about maps. It was about control, of truth, of perception, of the very fabric of belief that armies depended on. And as the presses in Berlin kept printing and the crates in London kept arriving, he realized the most terrifying part. The enemy didn't need to win battles if they could rewrite the battlefield itself.
March 1944. The Allied invasion of France was no longer a distant plan. It was a countdown. Every hour mattered. Every decision built toward a single day the world would remember. But behind the locked doors of a nondescript London office, two people knew that one hidden deception could destroy it all before it began. Lawrence Brennan and Major Helen Kowalski had uncovered enough to shake the foundation of Allied confidence. The maps, the sacred instruments of strategy, had been poisoned. They didn't know how many or which ones, but they knew it was enough to put the invasion at risk. And yet, they couldn't sound the alarm. If they went public, panic would ripple through every level of command. Thousands of officers, engineers, and planners relied on those maps. To admit they might be compromised was to admit that the foundation of the invasion itself could crumble. The orders were clear. Continue your duties, stay silent, let the higher offices decide. But silence, for Brennan, was unbearable. Every night he imagined landing craft scraping across sandbars that weren't supposed to exist, tanks sinking where maps promised firm ground, men fighting blind, lost between ink and reality.
He and Kowalski decided to act, quietly, methodically, and fast. They began comparing every Normandy chart in circulation. Using coded markings known only to them, they sorted the maps into groups: verified, questionable, and suspicious. For each suspicious sheet, they cross-referenced aerial reconnaissance, naval soundings, and reports from the French resistance. It was a colossal task. Day after day, they worked under the hum of the war machine, the air thick with cigarette smoke and exhaustion. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. 15%. That was the number they finally reached. Around 15% of all Normandy coastal maps contained subtle yet deliberate alterations. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. But when aligned against aerial photography, the differences stood out, like fractures beneath a perfect surface.
Beach gradients exaggerated, making dangerous landings look deceptively easy. Roads drawn slightly wider than they were, promising routes that couldn't support armored vehicles. Defensive structures omitted or moved farther inland, as if the enemy wanted the Allies to feel safe, just long enough to be trapped. The deception was surgical. One altered measurement might mean nothing, but 1,000 such details could steer an entire invasion off course. Kowalski realized the operation's brilliance and its fragility. They didn't need to fool everyone, she told Brennan. They just needed to fool the right people. The right people? The planners. The men who decided where others would land and die. There was no time to waste. They worked through the nights, cross-verifying every line of data with naval intelligence and air reconnaissance units. They had to rebuild trust in the most essential weapon of the invasion: knowledge. Slowly, a clearer picture formed. The corrupted maps were clustered around sectors that German defenses had quietly reinforced, as if the enemy expected the Allies to come straight for them. It wasn't random. It was design.
Kowalski arranged an urgent meeting with a senior intelligence officer. She presented their findings, the data, the photographs, the chemical tests. The evidence was undeniable. The forged maps had penetrated deep into Allied logistics. For a moment, the room was silent. Then came the question that no one wanted to voice. How do we fix this without letting the enemy know we found out? The answer was terrifyingly simple and impossibly complex. They couldn't expose the forgery publicly. If they did, the Germans would know their operation was compromised. They'd change tactics, or worse, create new deceptions. Instead, the Allies had to correct the maps in secret, quietly, before D-Day, and make it look like nothing had happened. The process began immediately. Verified versions were reprinted under armed supervision. Entire production lines were redirected, operating under the cover of standard updates. Every suspicious batch was quietly withdrawn and destroyed.
To outsiders, it looked like routine revision work. Inside, it was a silent emergency. The reorientation effort spread across every level of planning. Commanders were discreetly briefed that terrain updates required them to adjust landing strategies. Engineers recalibrated their beach models. Tank crews retrained on corrected gradients. Every change had to appear procedural, not a rescue operation from an invisible enemy. Meanwhile, Brennan and Kowalski worked with British intelligence to ensure the deception's architects never learned they'd been discovered. The Germans had to believe their operation still worked. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If even a whisper of the truth reached Berlin, the entire Allied deception campaign, including the planned misdirection toward Pas-de-Calais, could collapse. For Brennan, the pressure was unbearable. Weeks without sleep. Constant fear that one wrong word could undo everything. He felt the weight of every life depending on their secrecy.
On a gray April morning, as final invasion rehearsals began, Brennan stood by a window overlooking London's skyline. The city was waking to a new day, unaware that history's greatest gamble was being rewritten behind closed doors. He thought about the irony, how a war defined by tanks and bombers could hinge on paper and ink. When the corrected maps finally rolled off the presses, he held one in his hands. Every detail verified, every inch honest again. It was as if the truth itself had been restored, quietly, without ceremony, without applause. He and Kowalski sent the last batch to the invasion planners under total secrecy. No one would ever know what had been prevented, what almost happened. As he sealed the final crate, Brennan allowed himself one moment of calm. He wasn't proud, just relieved. But deep down, he understood something haunting. The enemy's operation had been more than sabotage. It had been a mirror, reflecting how easily even the most disciplined minds could be deceived when certainty felt comfortable. The war had always been about territory, but now it was about trust. And in that silent battle, truth had survived by the smallest of margins. The invasion would go forward. The maps were real again. But the illusion, the one that almost won the war, still lingered, invisible, waiting for its final act. April 1944. The truth about the forged maps was now contained in fewer than a dozen minds. Lawrence Brennan and Major Helen Kowalski had done their part. They had exposed the enemy's invisible hand. But what came next was something neither of them could have predicted. Instead of dismantling the German operation, Allied intelligence decided to use it. They called it controlled contamination. The idea was as dangerous as it was brilliant: to feed false confidence back into the German network that had once deceived them. If the Germans believed their forgeries were still in circulation,
They would continue adjusting their defenses to match their own lies. And if the Allies could predict where those lies led, they could use them to shape the battlefield. Deception would now fight deception. A meeting in a secured underground room of the London War Office set the plan in motion. Intelligence officers from Britain and America gathered around a table covered in both authentic and forged maps. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and the weight of what was being proposed.
Some argued that it was reckless, that any manipulation of the Germans' operation risked confusion on their own side. Others believed it was the perfect opportunity to turn the enemy's arrogance against itself. In the end, strategy prevailed. The plan was approved under complete secrecy. Only a handful of officers would know its full scope. The execution began quietly. Several of the forged maps, previously marked for destruction, were discreetly set aside. Among them were versions depicting the northern coast of France near Pas-de-Calais, the very region German intelligence already suspected as the most likely invasion point. Those maps became the foundation of a calculated illusion. Through controlled leaks, coded intercepts, and carefully planted intelligence in neutral territories, the Allies allowed hints of upcoming operations to circulate, all aligning perfectly with the geography shown on those forged maps. To the Germans, the evidence looked irresistible. Their own successful forgery operation had produced maps now appearing in use by the Americans. Their own lies were being confirmed by Allied activity.
In Berlin, Colonel Kruger received reports of troop buildups and naval exercises near the Thames. Reconnaissance photos appeared to show landing craft gathering opposite Calais. Every new signal reinforced his belief that the Allies were preparing to strike exactly where his maps suggested they would. It was a masterstroke, a deception built upon another deception. Meanwhile, real invasion planning continued in total secrecy. Brennan and Kowalski were no longer part of the central operation, but they knew enough to understand what was unfolding. The same forged maps that had once threatened to doom the invasion were now being used to mislead the enemy. The psychological symmetry fascinated Brennan. "We're using their reflection to blind them," he once said quietly to Kowalski. Every false assumption the Germans made became another layer of protection over Normandy. As spring turned to early summer, the German high command doubled down on their interpretation. Reports from their own spies confirmed Allied interest in Calais. Fake radio transmissions, created by the Allies, reinforced the illusion. Even the Luftwaffe began redirecting reconnaissance flights toward the wrong coast. Operation Kartenfilcher, the German forgery campaign, had become its own trap. Kowalski, now reassigned to an intelligence liaison unit, observed the results from a distance. She saw German responses shifting exactly as predicted. Their misplaced confidence had become a strategic asset. The forgeries they had created to control Allied movements were now controlling theirs. Still, the margin for error was razor thin. If even one German analyst realized the truth, that their own deception had been discovered and reversed, the entire invasion could be jeopardized. Every false radio message had to be perfectly timed. Every decoy operation meticulously staged. Even Allied soldiers stationed near southern England were fed scripted misinformation to maintain the illusion. Deception had become a living organism, feeding on secrecy and fear. By May 1944, the results were undeniable. German divisions began concentrating heavily near Calais, reinforcing coastal defenses and stockpiling artillery. Their most experienced units were kept far from Normandy, waiting for an attack that would never come.
The psychological war had reached its peak. Brennan watched from his small office as final preparations for D-Day took shape.
He knew the truth, that their greatest weapon wasn't a bomb, a tank, or a battleship. It was a story the enemy believed. One afternoon, Kowalski handed him a debriefing memo. It detailed the success of the counter-operation, but ended with a line that lingered in his mind. Deception remains most effective when no one celebrates it. There would be no public recognition, no medals. The entire affair would remain buried under classification for decades. But Brennan didn't care. The thought the truth had survived and then been turned into a shield was enough. Somewhere across the channel, the Germans were fortifying empty beaches, waiting for an invasion that would never come. And on the real beaches, the ones they ignored, the future was already waiting to land. The war of maps had come full circle. The weapon of lies had been reclaimed by truth. And now, as the final countdown began, history stood poised between illusion and reality, both drawn on paper, both ready to be tested by fire.
June 6, 1944. Before dawn, the English Channel was nothing but mist and movement. Thousands of ships advanced across the dark water, their wakes cutting thin white scars beneath the sky. The invasion of Normandy, the day the world had waited for, had begun. But this invasion was different. For the first time in modern warfare, an army was marching not only against the enemy, but against the ghosts of deception that had nearly broken it. On the decks of those ships, officers clutched their maps, clean, corrected, and true. They didn't know it, but the paper in their hands had been fought for just as fiercely as any beach. In a dim room in London, Lawrence Brennan stood over radio set, listening to coded reports filtering in from the French coast. Major Helen Kowalski stood beside him, her arms folded tightly. Neither spoke. Every message mattered. Every line of static carried the weight of years of secrecy. When the first reports arrived from Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches, Brennan felt the air leave his chest. The landings were holding. There were surprises, yes, stronger resistance in some sectors, rougher tides than expected, but the overall picture was clear. The maps were accurate. The truth had survived the test of war.
Hours turned into an endless blur of updates. Command posts buzzed with data. Ships adjusted positions. Air support struck with precision based on the very topography Brennan had helped save. In those chaotic hours, there was no time for reflection. But somewhere between the clatter of typewriters and the static of field radios, a quiet victory had already taken place. A victory of clarity over confusion. The invasion succeeded because men believed in what they saw, and what they saw was finally real. On the beaches, soldiers followed the gradients and landmarks that the corrected maps had shown them. They found exits exactly where they were supposed to be. Engineers cleared obstacles where the charts had predicted them. The tide measurements matched perfectly. At headquarters, the realization spread quietly. The deception had failed. The enemy had been watching the wrong coast. Far across the channel, in a darkened command post near Calais, German officers waited for the invasion that never came. Their communications lit up with confusion. Reports from Normandy at first sounded like diversions, small-scale attacks meant to distract from the real assault they believed was coming their way.
Colonel Heinrich Kruger, the architect of Operation Kartenfelscher, read the first intercepted Allied messages and froze. They didn't match his expectations. He ordered reconnaissance planes toward Calais, convinced the Normandy landings were a feint. Hours later, the truth began to dawn. Too late to matter. His perfect forgery had become a weapon turned against him. In London, Brennan read the reports in silence. His relief was not triumph. It was disbelief. For months, he had imagined disaster, the consequences of false maps and misplaced faith. Now,
Those same maps had guided the greatest invasion in history to success. But even victory carried its weight. He thought of the men on those beaches, the ones who would never know that the ground beneath their boots had once been drawn by the enemy. They would never know how close they had come to fighting in the wrong place against the wrong odds, guided by lies printed in German ink. That was the nature of invisible wars. Their heroes were never seen, and their triumphs never shouted. As the day went on, Allied command confirmed what Brennan and Kowalski had feared the most and what they had prevented. Had the forged maps been used, entire divisions might have landed in the wrong sectors. Tanks would have been trapped in soft terrain. Heavy artillery would have fired blind. German defenses would have been perfectly positioned to repel the landings. Historians would later estimate that thousands more lives could have been lost, perhaps even the entire invasion delayed or defeated. But none of that happened, because months earlier, one man had noticed a fraction of a millimeter's difference in a line of ink. When the official report came in that evening, Allied forces established on French soil, Brennan finally let himself breathe. He felt no celebration, only a quiet exhaustion. His eyes met Kowalski's, and in that shared silence lay everything they could never say aloud. They would receive no public acknowledgement. Their work was classified under the highest secrecy. The world would remember the beaches, the bravery, the sacrifice, but not the paper, not the eyes that had caught the lie before it became a tragedy. In Berlin, Operation Kartenfelscher was quietly erased from the record, its files sealed, its failures buried under layers of bureaucracy. For the Germans, it became an embarrassment. For the Allies, it became a secret too powerful to reveal.
As dawn broke over London the following day, Brennan stepped outside into the pale light. The city was still gray, still scarred by war, but for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He thought of the soldiers crossing into France, and the quiet, unspoken truth that victory sometimes began long before the first shot was fired. The war of deception had not been won on the battlefield, but in the unseen corners of ink, paper, and conviction. And though the world would never know his name, Lawrence Brennan had changed history, not by fighting on the beaches, but by seeing what others had missed. For in that silence before dawn, when truth and falsehood met on the same page, one man's attention to detail became the line that divided illusion from victory.
In the days after June 6, 1944, the German High Command was a fortress of disbelief. Radio reports from northern France arrived in fragments, chaotic, conflicting, impossible to reconcile. The Allies had landed in Normandy, not at Pas-de-Calais. To many in Berlin, it seemed absurd. The invasion, they insisted, could not have begun there. Inside a reinforced office near Tempelhof, Colonel Heinrich Kruger spread maps across his desk, his hands trembling slightly. The coastline of Normandy stared back at him in clean lines and measured gradients, lines he himself had helped create. They were perfect copies, too perfect. For months, Kruger's forged maps had fed the enemy exactly what they wanted to see. And yet somehow, those same illusions had now betrayed him. At first, he refused to believe the reports. His aides assured him that the Normandy landings were only diversions. The real invasion, they said, would come where his maps predicted, at Calais, where Germany's strongest defenses waited. Even Hitler himself clung to that belief, ordering the generals to hold their positions. But the hours passed, then days, and the diversion did not end.
German units in Normandy sent desperate messages describing overwhelming Allied forces, paratrooper drops, and naval bombardments unlike anything they'd seen before. Slowly, reality began to bleed through the cracks of denial. The deception had reversed. In the very rooms where Kruger had once been praised for his ingenuity, silence now replaced celebration. Analysts reviewed intercepted Allied communications, trying to understand how their enemy had discovered the forgery operation. No one had an answer. For Kruger, the truth came like a quiet realization, not a dramatic revelation. He understood that the Allies hadn't just uncovered the forgeries, they had used them. His own lies had been mirrored back at him, turned into a trap.
He looked again at the Pas-de-Calais region, marked in bold red, a coastline reinforced with extra artillery, armored divisions, and concrete bunkers, all of it waiting for an enemy that would never come. Tens of thousands of German troops stood idle, misdirected by their own false intelligence, while the Allies surged through Normandy's hedgerows. Kruger's voice remained calm in meetings, but his eyes betrayed him. The precision that once defined him now seemed hollow. Every measurement, every contour, every line he had crafted with obsessive care, all had been meaningless. He had built a lie so flawless that even the truth couldn't escape it.
As the Allies advanced inland, German command attempted to correct course. Orders shifted rapidly, counterattacks organized, reinforcements redirected, but the delay was fatal. By the time their forces moved, the beachheads were already secure, the invasion unstoppable. The illusion that once promised control now delivered chaos. For Kruger, the psychological weight was unbearable. He avoided his printing facility, now silent except for the faint hum of idle presses. The same machines that had once produced weapons of deception now stood as monuments to failure. Reports from France painted an unrecognizable picture. Allied columns moving deeper into Europe, liberated towns greeting them, resistance networks rising in strength. Every German counteraction seemed one step behind, as if the war itself had shifted into a dimension where the truth no longer obeyed them. The mapmaker's war was over. But even as he faced professional ruin, Kruger couldn't help but marvel at the symmetry of it all. The Allies had beaten him not with superior weapons, but with understanding, by learning to think like deceivers and then outplaying them at their own game. In a final memorandum to his superiors, Kruger wrote one sentence that would later be found in his confiscated files. The danger of falsehood is not that it misleads others, it is that it convinces those who create it. After the war, few records of Operation Kartenfelscher survived. Most were destroyed as the Reich crumbled. But among the fragments recovered by Allied intelligence, investigators found notes confirming what Brennan and Kowalski had long suspected, that the German forgery campaign had continued, though on a smaller scale, even after its exposure. They kept trying. They couldn't stop. The addiction to control through deception had become its own disease. And yet, it was already too late. The Allies now verified every map with multiple sources, aerial surveys, and chemical markers. Trust, once broken, had rebuilt itself stronger than before. For the Germans, it was the opposite. Doubt had infected every document, every report. They no longer trusted their own intelligence. Even authentic maps were now treated with suspicion. The ultimate irony of Operation Kartenfelscher was that it didn't just fail to deceive the enemy, it had destroyed the deceivers themselves. As the Allies marched east and Berlin prepared for its final reckoning, Kruger's factory fell silent. The presses that once hummed with certainty now gathered dust in the cold. The war of maps was over. The paper front had collapsed, and the men who once believed they could shape reality learned that truth, no matter how small or fragile, always finds its way back through the cracks of illusion. Summer 1944. While Allied forces advanced across France, a different war unfolded in silence, a hunt for the network that had nearly rewritten history. In London, a small intelligence unit began tracing the origins of the forged maps. Lawrence Brennan and Major Helen Kowalski were recalled to assist. Their task? Follow the paper trail that had once carried lies across oceans. The investigation started with fragments, mislabeled crates, unusual shipping logs, and chemical tests on paper fibers. One lead pointed to Lisbon, where Allied cargo had been delayed under suspicious circumstances. The seals were perfect, yet microscopic residues suggested the crates had been opened and resealed. From Portugal, the trail wound into Switzerland. A respected Zurich printing firm, known for academic atlases, had unknowingly sold specialty paper to neutral middlemen tied to German intelligence. The paper matched the texture of the forgeries found in London.
Then came Spain. At Santander's docks, customs clerks described nighttime shipments passing under diplomatic privilege. Bribes, it turned out, had ensured those crates moved unchecked toward Allied convoys. The pattern was clear. Germany had built its deception through neutral ports and legitimate businesses, hiding treachery behind trade. Raids followed in quiet coordination. Agents swept through Lisbon, Zurich, and Madrid. A handful of intermediaries were detained, but among the intercepted messages, one name kept reappearing: Philip Marsh, an American civilian contractor, logistics liaison for the Army Map Service. He had access to shipment schedules, serial codes, and verification routines, precisely the data the enemy had needed.
At first, Brennan refused to believe it. Marsh had been trusted, efficient, unremarkable. Yet Swiss bank records told another story: regular gold deposits, transferred through accounts linked to German fronts. When questioned, Marsh insisted he was no spy. They asked for shipping dates, not secrets, he said. It was harmless. But Brennan knew how close harmless had come to catastrophe. One man's carelessness had nearly shifted the course of the war. Within weeks, the network unraveled. German couriers were captured, bribed dock workers exposed, and false trade routes shut down. The Allied report that closed the case contained a single sentence Brennan never forgot: "The enemy did not breach our walls. We opened the gate for him." By autumn, the forgery chain had collapsed. No headlines, no trials, no triumph, just silence.
The discovery brought no satisfaction, only a sobering truth. The Germans had exploited not weakness, but confidence. The Allies had believed their own procedures were infallible, and that belief had almost undone them. When Brennan turned in his final report, he wrote one line beneath his signature: "Truth survived, but only because doubt refused to die." And with that, the War of Maps ended, leaving behind not victory or vengeance, but a warning carved in secrecy. In war, certainty can be the most dangerous illusion of all.